Okay, it's recording. Hello, everyone. We're going to talk about Lacanian psychoanalysis, and I was thinking that we can talk about sort of the tenets of Lacan, how he sort of draws on Freud, and then how sort of Deleuze and Guattari sort of answer Lacan. So we're going to be talking a bit about psychoanalysis, like the sort of pros of Lacan and the cons of Lacan. Get it? Whatever. Okay, play on words. So I guess we want to first start out with who we are as people. So we want to start off with what we call the mirror stage. It's one of the sort of essential stages that Lacan isolates when he sort of determines how the lack gets created, or how, the lack sort of comes into existence. So imagine you're a baby, right? And as babies, we only have needs, not really what Lacan would call desires, right? We have needs, we need food, we need water, right? We need these sort of things when we're babies. And when we're babies, we don't really understand that there's an idea of the self, right? Sort of the concept of a self is really foreign in general, right? Because when you're a baby, you're only trying to get your needs. The second sort of desire comes into play is when the sort of self can be understood. So the mirror stage, right, as Lacan understands it, is the sort of metaphor or even a literal mirror where the baby looks in that mirror and they understand that they themselves are a human, that they are themselves different than the world around them, right? So the mirror stage allows for there to be, of course, a person, right? A baby is a person, but at the same time, they don't recognize that they're a person until that mirror stage. So the mirror stage is pretty much the foundation for how Lacan understands the three parts of the psyche, right? So when you can understand that you are an individual, you now have to put yourself in relation to other things. When you're a baby, you're not like, I'm a baby and that's my food, but rather you say, I need that food. But us as human beings, we are now, after we encounter that mirror stage, we recognize that we are people. We put ourselves in relation to everything else, right? So this is sort of the foundational starting point for Lacanian psychoanalysis that allows for the three parts of the psyche. And the first part that gets created sort of during that mirror stage is what he calls the imaginary, right? The imaginary is in itself narcissistic. The imaginary is the development of your ego. The second you recognize you're a person, what do you want to do? You want to try to be your ideal person, right? You now recognize that you are in relation to other things. So you're a person, you want to be that ideal person, right? And that's what we sort of call the imaginary. The imaginary is very pivotal in Lacan's work, because not only is it the development of the ego, but it's sort of striving for an ideal self that will never be wholly ideal, right? We are constantly in life trying to strive to become the best person that we can be, right? We're trying to find meaning in this sort of life that we have. But within that meaning, we realize, and sometimes I guess we don't really realize, that we can never really find that meaning. So we will always constantly strive to create meaning for ourselves. And that meaning will never be there, right? And Lacan, being sort of the into psycholinguistics, he sort of says that the way that we are able to conceptualize meaning or create meaning is through language, right? So in the context of policy debate, which a lot of you are in, it's policy debate says, hey, we can have sort of language to pass particular policies, right? Create internal link chains. And then that is sort of able to generate some type of meaning for the world around us, right? We're able to create meaning out of the words that we use. And it is true, right? Our words do have particular meaning to them. But at the same time, it's not able to create, or it's not a stable structure to create meaning off of, right? So language is the only way that we can create sort of meaning for ourselves, but we'll never fully be able to get there. And we know that through things like depression, PTSD, schizophrenia, right? You can think of really anything, any mental illness, right, as something. And if you do not have depression, can someone ever really describe depression enough to you that you will truly know what it is? No, right? You can't get to that point. You can say, yeah, depression means you're really sad, but it's more than that, right? Or PTSD, for example. There are things that do have particular meaning, or that we can generate, the language that we use can sort of, for example, what I'm trying to say is this is a water bottle, right? And we know that this is a water bottle just because it's a hydro flask, and hydro flasks are awesome. But we're able to sort of create meaning for the world around us through language, but language is it's not able to generate that meaning for our lives. And Lacan comes to this understanding through signs and signifiers. Also, would it be easier if I did like write this down like as we go along? I can share my screen too, or we can keep talking. I mean, if it's not necessary, then I don't need to.
I'm taking notes as we do it.
Just making sure. So yeah, so with that being said, Lacan says, yeah, when we hit that mirror stage, we have an idea of an ego. We try to fill that ego, right? We try to be that ideal self. And the only way that we can try and do that is through language, right? Very, very simple stuff. But Lacan takes that even a step further and says that language in words, right? This is just a construction, right? Language it's all constructed, right? Why does the word, like, for example, if we take a stop sign, right? Stop signs, why does the word stop mean to literally stop, right? It's something incredibly arbitrary, right? That we say that has meaning. So Lacan comes to this through what he understands as signs and signifiers. Now, a stop sign is a literal sign, right? It's a literal sign, but it still signifies something. What does it signify? It signifies to stop, right? The word chair, right? When I say that word, you all think of a different chair, right? But at the same time, it all signifies the same exact thing, i.e. sitting down, right? Potentially taking notes in your chair, right? Etc. So signs and significations are sort of how we're able to create meaning for the world around us, even though we can never truly be whole. Now, because we can't be whole, this is what Lacan understands as the lack. You probably heard the lack before a lot, and a lot of people, like to throw it around a lot, but essentially it just means that void that we have, that we aren't able to fill, that ideal self that we are never able to truly become, right? That is the lack. And we try to fill that lack, right? And we might try to do that with things, right? Maybe if I get my degree, my life will be complete. Maybe if I get a family, my life will be complete. Maybe if I have a job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, with that being said, that lack is predicated, for Lacan, it's predicated off of desire, right? We desire, the way in which Lacan understands desire, it's always in reference to the lack. Later on, we will talk about how Deleuze and Guattari understand desire a bit differently, right? All of these critical theorists conceptualize desire differently. So desire for Lacan is always in relation to the lack, i.e. everything that we do is all predicated off of trying to fulfill that lack that we had, that was sort of there once the mirror stage occurred, right? So very, very simple. So the imaginary is the first part of Lacanian, how Lacan understands the psyche, right? There are three. First, we start off with that sort of imaginary, but not only is that important, the second part of the psyche is the symbolic. For Lacan, the symbolic or the symbolic order is this sort of universal structure that encompasses all of our entire human existence. So for example, there are certain norms, rules, and things that you have to follow that encompass our existence. For example, grammar and language, right? Language is a structure, it's a system. If you say things out of order, you are not following that order. So sort of that second part is what we follow, right? That what we follow. So for example, if you just like have a ton of words that don't make any sense in relation to one another, that doesn't make any sense. But it doesn't make sense because of this symbolic order, right? The way that we conceptualize meaning, the way that we have a universal structure encompassing our entire existence, right? And it sort of appears, right? I'll say quote because I found this. It says, quote, it appears as an essentially unconscious latent apparatus, right? It's something that's sort of always there that we might not be able to tie to that, right? The sort of laws, government, the way that the world functions is all predicated off of this order, right? This symbolic order, because it's all symbols, right? Laws, bills, the government, it's all predicated off of symbols, right? Language that we are able to use to not only derive meaning, but to fulfill a particular order, i.e. the USFG should, right? Particularly in the context of policy debate, right? So that's where these people are getting a lot of their link claims, is because, hey, you're trying to uphold and follow this particular order, but that order doesn't make any sense unless you give it meaning, right? Which is what you do.
Right.
So that's the symbolic order. It's particularly precisely that of the signifier. And sort of what that means is that it involves the function of speech and language, but it's still sort of a signification of how things ought to, or a signification of how things should be operating, rather than just a particular sign. The social order that we have to follow, the symbolic order that we have to follow, is always predicated sort of off of those signifiers that we have to give into, right? I.e., stop means to stop. The social order says, hey, you have to stop. That's what the symbolic order sort of tells us to do. And again, anyone can add on, but what this allows for, right? What the symbolic order allows for, according to Lacan, is two things. It allows for the big other and the little other. And when I say the big other, I mean the other with a capital O. Little other is the other lowercase o. What does this mean? Well, the big other is sort of how we give legitimacy to things. So for example, the big other is the social order. It's given legitimacy through language. And the big other is sort of what we are always trying and in relation to, i.e. like the government can be viewed as the big other, or the structure of language is viewed as the big other, right? How the big other sees us is something that we find to be very important. And the little other, right? It's not the exact same thing. It sort of it takes the traits that the big other necessitates. The word that we can think of is the word pious, right? Pious it can be thought of as the big other, but it also has particular traits that necessitate the little other, i.e. sobriety, right? i.e. Other things like that. So when we think about language, you can think of that as like a big other, but there are still structures and rules, right? More minutia, but what can give legitimacy to language? Grammar, capitalization, periods at the end of sentences, right? So the symbolic order is very, very complicated, because the symbolic order tells us how we do things, but it's predicated off of, hey, here's this large structure, i.e. potentially the government, and then there's all these other traits like departments or, bureaucratic nonsense type of stuff. So that's the way that we can sort of think of and conceptualize symbolic order. And again, we're thinking about it very theoretically. This is still a stage, or this is a part of our psyche that Lacan isolates, right? If we can follow the social order to a T, how does that feed our ego? That makes us feel kind of good, right? Like, oh, I'm good. I follow this order. I follow this law. I'm a good human being, right? So humans are able to create meaning off of following these particular symbolic social orders, right? Even though these are all still functionally constructed, right? Through our psyche of trying to create meaning, right? It's just a continual process of creating meaning, right? So that's the second part. Are there any particular questions or anything you want to add, Abby, maybe about, the mirror stage, the lack, the symbolic order, the big other, little other, anything?
I think the only thing is that you explain the real and the lack, but or the real, the lack, and the imaginary. Oh my god. So you describe the imaginary, symbolic, and the lack. There we go. But I think a key part of that is the real.
So that's exactly the next part, right? Because that's okay, cool. The way that we can separate Lacan's career is through literally these three stages, right? He literally thought of these stages at different points in his career. I literally think it is in the order. I could be wrong. I thought it was in the order of imaginary, symbolic, the real. Right, over the course over the course of his career with what he did, that's sort of how you can separate it, right? Now, the real is important. The real literally means the real, self, and I'll put self in quotes, I guess. It's more along the lines of, it's what was severed at the mirror stage, right? Us as individuals, it's that constant strive to get back to who we were prior to the mirror stage, because we want to know who we are, right? What we want to be. Now, the real itself is what we are trying to strive for. And you can think of the real as the need. There's no separation between you and desire, right? That's what makes the real so interesting, is that we constantly strive for this, even though how we know our lives is always predicated off of desire. So what would that really mean for us to really revert back to the real? Is that even possible, right? That's like another question, right? So a lot of people in debate, they're like, our alternative, right? Can that alternative ever really get to the real? What is the alternative even supposed to do, etc.? We'll talk about that. Usually, and the reason why I say psychoanalysis doesn't really make sense, at least on the neg, maybe even on the AF, is that psychoanalysis is something that prescribes a problem, right? But it doesn't fully offer the solution. It's saying, hey, this is the problem, but what's the solution to any of this, right? I.e., yes, all of these things, all of these stages might exist, right? But what are we supposed to do about it? So let's just continue with the real. There's no separation between you and your needs. Fairly animalistic if you think about it, right? The way that animals, dogs, for example, there's really no separation. They're just a dog. They do the same thing every day, right? And they have their needs, right? And they need to fulfill those needs to survive. You know, that's the sort of, you know, what we are trying to get at when we try to fulfill that lack, right? Yet the same time, we say that we want to fulfill this lack, yet we don't. We do not want to fulfill this lack. We truly don't, because we enjoy the process of desiring, right? So this is where the process of jouissance comes into play. Jouissance means enjoyment. Really, it just means to enjoy. But in the context of what Lacan is saying, jouissance is more about the sort of, you should think about it as desiring rather than desired. Us as individuals, we love to continue desiring things, right? It's a constant process that we always like to engage in, and we never really like it to make it to the end, right? You can think about it like how I've been told, it's like sort of climbing a mountain, right? And this is where we'll get into the death drive. But when you climb a mountain, right, you're getting there, and then when you make it to the top, you know, you think like, hey, once I make it to the top, it'll be awesome. But part of that journey was the climb, right? Part of that journey was, in fact, that climb. So we're never really striving truly, right, for that fulfillment of the lack, because we like that process, right? It's something that is really, really, I don't know, I guess destructive, right? The fact that we know and that we like strive for something, yet we always stop ourselves from getting there. Like we always stop ourselves. And that is sort of more of the impact level, right? As you could say, it's like, well, what happens when we don't achieve the real? You know, people say ressentiment, they say lash out, right? They say all of these things. I mean, again, we could talk about how to like answer that like more in depth, but that's what they say, right? But one of the big things that I like to focus on, and the thing that Lacan focused on, is anxiety. I mean, you probably have heard this in like psychoanalysis debates if you've ever been in them. The word anxiety gets thrown around a bit. In seminar 9 of what Lacan talked about in 1962, he talked about what anxiety is. And he said anxiety is, quote, the sensation of the desire of the other. So what does that mean? The sensation of the desire of the other. Well, anxiety is sort of how you think the other, and when I say other, I mean big other. So when you think of big other, you think of rules, social norms, right? Things like that you have to follow. So what happens when you don't follow those things? Anxiety, right? How do you think the big other will perceive you? For example, if you've ever taken a test and you felt anxious about it, I mean, you and I both know that test doesn't really mean your whole life, right? It just doesn't. But rather, what happens if you fail that test? It's the sensation of the desire of the other. It's how you are scared about how the other will perceive you, right? If you are not perceived as that intelligent individual who is able to get all those questions correct, right? You are anxious, right? You have anxiety, right? What happens if you lose that debate round, right? Particularly, you know, you get anxious, right? So that's sort of something that I think is important when you understand this, because again, it's all within our minds, but our minds can cause us to do violent, destructive things, right? Which is now, after discussing the three parts of the psyche in the mirror stage, we can now get into what we call the death drive, right? And this is a really, really big part of what they talk about. But before we get to the death drive, though, there's one quick thing I did want to say, is that Lacan does try to make a departure from Freud, particularly a little bit, right? There are still ties from Lacan to Freud. There's actually a lot of ties, which is why Deleuze and Guattari are like, screw Lacan. Like Lacan's work is too tied to Freud, and Freud is incorrect. And they have a lot of books that we can get to later about that. But essentially, the way that you can think of Lacan is he's very similar to Freud. Are you all familiar with the id, the ego, and the superego? Well, Freud's id, the superego, and the ego, all of that relates to the same exact three parts of the psyche, right? The id is sort of the animalistic drive, those tendencies. Well, what part of that, what part of it is that for Lacan? That animalistic drive. Is it the imaginary? Is it the symbolic order? Or is it the real, right? So the id would correlate to what?
Wouldn't that be the real?
It would be the real, right? Because the id is sort of those desires that there's no social order to stop you from doing things, right? There's nothing. It's just like you are able to be that sort of animalistic, right, self that, you know, part of you is, and part of your psyche is, right? What would the super ego be in terms of Lacan's understanding of the psyche? The superego tells us that we have to do the right thing, that we have to be moral, because there is a moral code that gets, you know, created through particular orders.
Symbolic order.
Exactly. The superego is a symbolic order. And then you can guess it. Remember, we just started out with what is the imaginary? It's the creation of that ego, right? It creates the self. So really, Lacan and Freud, in a lot of what they talk about, they're not really super different. Right? They're not really super different. Yes, Freud does say that there is an inherent desire to have sexual relations with your parents through what he coins the Oedipal complex, right? And Lacan says, yeah, that might be true. That might be something that is true, but there's still an inherent lack within everyone that we all try to fill. So they do disagree with each other a little bit, and there is some tension, right? Because Lacan does try to take away from the Oedipal complex, but D&G, Deleuze and Guattari, are actually like, nah, you don't. So it is pretty interesting to see how all of these critical theorists, psychoanalysts talk about it. Okay, the next thing. So yeah, we can see that. The sort of next part is going to be about the death drive. Now, what is the death drive? Well, the death drive is this constant strive for, or a constant drive for destruction, death, etc. Right? We have this drive where we destroy everything in our path because we're not able to fulfill the lack. We're not able to find meaning, right? Because meaning cannot be created. So the death drive is pretty interesting, and it's what a lot of people say in policy debate, right? As like, you know, the death drive is bad, death drive, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, it's sort of just saying that it's a lash out because we can never achieve the object ah, right? Object ah is another sort of big portion. The object ah is that desire, that sort of desire to, you know, to fulfill that lack. Can you ever achieve that? No, you can never achieve your object ah because you truly believe that, you know, you want to do that, but you will always stop yourself from doing that, right? So every time you think you get closer and closer and closer, and then it fails, boom, death drive, right? And that's what creates your desire for destruction. It's because, you know, deep down, you know, subconsciously, that you will never really be able to uncover that meaning, right? So what do? Destroy everything in your path. You know, destroying everything in your path looks different to some people than it does to others. But, you know, it's not even just destroying everything in your path, but rather it's desiring failure. How do you understand success? Through failure. If you never fail in your life, then I guess, like, what's the point, right? That's sort of the way that you can sort of conceptualize the death drive. Are there any other comments on the death drive, Abby, that you would like to add?
Well, okay, I think like the most simplest way of explaining it is just like we like to engage in the taboo. Whatever society tells us not to do, we always like try to push those limits, and that's like the basis of the death drive. Because we always want to continue to push those limits without dying, but we just like choose to not help ourselves because I mean, why not? You know, like society tells us not to, so we continue to push ourselves, and that's like the basis of the death drive. It's also a sister to pleasure principle, if you know what that is.
Yeah, would you like to explain?
I'm not great at explaining pleasure principle.
Sure. So, like, at least
If
from
you
my
want to.
understanding, and again, I'm not like a super hardcore professional at all of this, sort of how I understand the pleasure principle is essentially saying that we as humans desire ultimate pleasure, right? And usually the way that it's described is through libido. Abby, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, a lot of this does drive from sexual pleasure, right? The libido, right? Which is also where the libidinal economy comes into play, right? It's because it is this pleasure principle that we always strive to sort of get pleasure in any way possible, right? Based off of that sort of libidinal economy, even if it is in destructive ways, right? So Abby is 100% correct. It's like we want to sort of push those levels of the symbolic order almost, right? It's deep down we want to sort of rebel against like the nature of everything around us just because we're not able to achieve that object A, right? We're not able to achieve that object A. So I do like what she's adding there about the you know pleasure principle, because it allows for a really good discussion about the libidinal economy, right? It's these sort of drives that individuals have predicated off of this pleasure principle. And these drives are destructive and dangerous and problematic, right? Which is why you can have a lot of bad assumptions that are just ingrained in you subconsciously, right? And you know, those bad things can result in self-destructive behaviors and other violence and things like that, right? These sort of desires exist within three sort of states of desire. I guess you can think about it as the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious, right? The conscious is literally the part of you that has focal awareness. The subconscious, you're not currently in focal awareness. And then sort of the unconscious is the processes of the mind that happen that you aren't able to think introspectively about. For example, like when you sleep, you're not able to think introspectively about your dreams while you're sleeping because you're unconscious, right? Whereas your subconscious desires is, man, maybe I did that really messed up thing to that person because I have this drive based off of some trauma I had in my childhood, for example, right? So the conscious, subconscious, and unconscious, it's desires. I mean, Lacan recognizes that desires operate differently, right? But it's all for the same exact purpose, that is to fulfill the lack. So that's sort of like my understanding of Lacanian psychoanalysis that I think is particularly important in the realm of debate and in the realm of what I have done research on. I mean, there's just like so much about it that it can be tied to sort of every aspect of life because, you know, our brains create the world around us. So really everything. So that's sort of my discussion. Was that at all clear about like what Lacanian psychoanalysis was? Just because I'm trying to get better at explaining it. And if you would like to move on, we could do one of two things. We could talk about it in the context of how to run it and execute it and how to beat it in debate, or we can talk about Deleuze and Guattari's understanding, but it's up to you all.
Well, first, I think that it was a good explanation. This is like the first psychoanalysis lecture I've ever been to, but everything I've heard in passing has not been as substantial as this. As for how we proceed, I'm indifferent.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I appreciate the compliment. I mean, I'm trying to figure it out on my own. It's very, very difficult, especially when you don't have like a ton of people to talk to about it. Like, there's just not a lot of people to talk to about these things because, you know, again, it's hard to access, right? How do you start on that journey? How do you know who Lacan is if you've never heard of him? You know what I'm saying? So that's why I think it's important to even just have these discussions and point out the flaws and the stuff like that. Well, what about you, Abby? Do you have any particular thing that you would want to talk about in the context of this?
I'm kind of cool with whatever. I think you did a good job, Noah. You should be a teacher.
Thank you.
You are fantastic at
Thank
explaining
you.
things.
That's one thing. I mean, my biggest thing is I was working on, I want to be a professor. That was my biggest thing.
Mm-hmm.
Getting into psych, it's like, I kind of want to do this, but maybe just teach it. It sounds fun. I don't know. Well, if you're ready to move on, we could talk about D&G. Just because I know Michigan, they released a camp app about D&G.
Yeah,
D&G.
I haven't read it yet.
Yeah, and it's just good to know these
Didn't
critical
feel like
theories
it.
and how they interact with Lacan.
Yeah.
Right? So we can talk about that. All right. Well, if you're down to keep talking, we can do it. And again, if you do get bored or like you want to dip, I totally understand. And it's also recorded, so you can get it another time. Okay? So Deleuze and Guattari, who are these people? Well, it's actually kind of funny. Felix Guattari was a student of Lacan's. They actually knew each other very well, and he studied at, Lacan's school, right? So they have a lot of sort of influence off of Lacan, but they created, and they worked together, they created to write this book called Anti-Oedipus. And Anti-Oedipus is literally just a really big book that's just like, LOL, Lacan, you're wrong. So a fun little fact about it, which I think is super funny, is that when they were writing this book together, right, Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, it's Lacan got word that they were writing a book, and he was like, hey, Guattari, are you writing a book that's like against me? And he's like, no, that's Deleuze. I'm not really writing too much. So then Lacan literally got like Guattari really drunk one night and then just tried to like psychoanalyze him about the book. It's super funny. Like, the intertwinings of these guys is just hilarious. But anyways, they did write this book. They wrote two really that are a critique of Lacan. They think that Lacan has such a strong tie to the Oedipal complex that they find it very problematic. And they sort of come to this conclusion by not saying that the Oedipal complex is always, your father, your mother, and you, but rather the Oedipal complex is able to be Oedipal in a lot of other ways. So when they say Oedipal, I just want to let you all know, they aren't necessarily talking about the father, mother, and you and those sexual relations that Freud talks about. They're really not. Rather, they understand that Lacan's trying to get away from Freud, but they're saying he's still there. And we can think about that through his very rigid claims about desire, right? i.e., what we were talking about, fulfilling the lack, right? That's very rigid claim of desire. And secondly, you can look at it as literally the three stages of the psyche with what Lacan talks about is just like the ego, id, superego. He just explains it a little bit differently, right? So Lacan does have a very strong tie to Freud, particularly the Oedipal complex. And this whole book, it's super long and super in-depth. And again, this is just from what I have read of the book and what I've talked to people about the book, because I am in a anti-Oedipus reading group right now on a Discord. The book is essentially saying that Lacan is tied to the Oedipal because every time he tries to detach away from it, he tries to detach away from it with a particular point that's always Oedipal. So for example, take a triangle, right? If he tries to get away from the Oedipal complex, he'll take a point on that triangle and make another triangle, right? So he will always be sort of embedded in the Oedipal complex. I think Ethan left, but he'll probably be back. Now, with that being said, though, he's always Oedipal because there's always some overarching figure that has to particularly diagnose or solve that problem. When you think of Lacan, it's always you think of like you and like, on one of those like sofas, and then like they're diagnosing you with all these problems, right? Same sort of deal with so that's how they say you are still not far away from Freud, because you have to ascribe there to be a higher authority or a higher power in some instance that you always attach yourself to, that makes it so your desire is always implicated with those higher people in power. So for example, it's like you always rely on the psychiatrist to be able to solve all of your problems, right? And that is something very Oedipal, at least in the way that they describe what Oedipal means, right? So they say that that, you know, Lacan is very, very rigid, and they have sort of come up with their understanding of desire, and their understanding of desire is what they call rhizomatic. What does it mean to be rhizomatic? Well, they talk about rhizomatic and they talk about arborescent. Arborescent is very linear. It's a linear understanding of thought. So when you think of arborescent thought, it's always one particular way to solve for a problem, i.e., we have to use the government to solve for the criminal justice system. D and G say this is problematic because we should be understanding desire in a way that's not just, you know, within one thing, but desire for everybody operates so differently, and desire changes all the time, right? That talking about things in this arborescent way doesn't make sense. So that's how they also critique Lacan, is because they say, hey, your understanding of desire is always about this lack that exists. And yeah, maybe that lack does exist, but the way that you always have everything in relation to the lack doesn't make sense. And they come up to this conclusion by talking about assemblage theory. So what is assemblage theory? I mean, Abby, you probably know when you've heard of it. Assemblage theory, what we can think of is it's sort of a step further than intersectionality. Assemblage theory is that identities and the way that the sort of world is structured is always overlapping and constantly changing, right? Aspects of people's identity constantly code and and they change each other all the time, right? You know, even your identity, everyone's identity, it's not just some static thing that happens at a particular intersection, and that's you, but rather sometimes your gender might overcode your sexuality in some instances. Sometimes your race might overcode your gender, right? It just sort of depends, and it's constantly fluctuating, right? So the way that Deleuze and Guattari talk about desire and assemblages is they say that the world is constantly changing. People's desires constantly change all the time. So if that's sort of true, why are we all approaching a problem in the same exact way, right? That's very arborescent to say, oh, by the way, we have to approach the problem in one way, because that sort of fails to understand that things change constantly and we should be sort of rhizomatic. Well, what do they talk about? What do they mean when they say rhizomatic? They mean non-arborescent. They mean a lot of different types of movements. I can't really tell you what movements they say are good or bad, because in their book, 1,000 Plateaus, they don't really isolate any particular movements. They just say that what's happening now, with only viewing the state and the institution as the end-all be-all, is bad, right? So D and G are a critique of Lacan, and because they are a critique of Lacan, they come up with their understanding of desire, arborescent thought, rhizomatic thought, and they use that as a critique of capitalism, right? So D and G are very, very fascinating, and they are a critique of Lacan. And particularly, they just disagree with each other on the concept of desire. Lacan is very arborescent in his understanding of desire, i.e. we always have to fulfill that lack, and that's the one thing that we always try to do, and if we don't do that, we're destructive human beings. D and G are like, maybe like there is like some, void that we cannot fill, but we all have desire that operates in different ways, right? So their understanding of desire is threefold. So the first part of their desire, they talk about something called desiring machines. So this is how D and G come up with their understanding of desire. They say that the world is structured through particular parts. And what they mean by that is the example that they give is a cisgendered mother, right, and a baby. It's like the mouth of the baby desires, what they say is the breast of the mother, right? And they say that because is the mouth of the baby the whole baby? No. Is the breast of the mother the whole mother? No, of course not. So with that, they say that desire operates in relation to everything, right? Desire is everywhere, constantly changing, constantly doing its own thing, right? And they come to that conclusion by a sum of parts, right? So everything in relation to everything else has some type of desire, if that makes sense. If there are any questions, let me know. The second sort of part where they understand desire is through what they call form of content, I believe. And what that means is they come to this conclusion that yes, there are sum of parts, right? Like the mouth of the baby, blah, blah, blah. But there are also entire institutions that exist that desire. So for example, the prison's desire, right, is that to lock up criminals, right? That's like the desire of the prison, or like the desire of the institution is to do X, Y, Z. But whoever they're affecting, right, i.e. the criminal, that criminal doesn't desire really to get caught. So desire operates two very, very different ways in that instance, right? So because the way that desire functions differently for each and every individual, they come to a conclusion that desire, of course, exists as an assemblage, because the institution itself is comprised of a multitude of parts. And the sort of last part where D&G understand their concept of desire is through their understanding of spatiality. So what is spatiality? It literally just means the spaces that we implicate. For example, this classroom that I am in, this classroom is a space where we re-territorialize it, we territorialize it, and then we deterritorialize it. So what does that mean? So this is the third part of desire. They say, and they use the example of a flower and a bee, right? Super, super simple. The flower literally territorializes the ground, right? The flower is on the ground. That is the flower spot, right? Such as how this classroom territorializes the space and the land that it's on. But it's able to get re-territorialized by the bee, or like students coming into classrooms, right? It's like we utilize this space. And then from there, you deterritorialize. So you take what you want from it, maybe you leave a bit of yourself or something from it, i.e. the bee affects the flower, you know, and then leaves. And that's sort of their understanding of how spaces operate, but they do talk about it in the context of desire, because even though the flower and the bee both have different end goals, they both benefit greatly off of each other, and they desire each other because of the spaces that they are implicated on. So desire is definitely multifaceted for D&G, and their understanding of territorialization is incredibly important, because it only goes to show that desire cannot just be this one-size-fits-all approach, because all of us approach the world and are affected differently. For example, the classrooms cannot be those same exact classrooms if you're not in those classrooms. For example, you're on the debate team, right? The debate community would not be the same exact community without you, Abby, right? And at the same time, you would not be you without the debate community, right? So the way that space operates is it constantly changes who we are, and then we change the space that we are on, right? So whereas Lacan says we utilize those spaces to fulfill meaning in our lives, rather they say that, you know, D&G say that we utilize those spaces to become, right, different people, right? So it's sort of just this process, right? And they say that taking a rhizomatic approach, understanding that the spaces that we are on have the potentiality to create transformative change. We can change who we are as individuals. We can change those spaces. That is what allows us as individuals to be able to go out and challenge structures of violence and structures of oppression and just fucked up structures in general, right? So D&G, they have a lot to say about all of this. And that's sort of how they understand desire in the context of Lacan. So yeah, I think that's sort of the gist of my, you know, lecture discussion that we have today about, you know, when we encounter psychoanalysis and when we encounter these critical theories, we have to be skeptical, right? Just taking all of these things as if they're true might not be good, because it seems very easy that Lacan is just correct in everything he says, but after listening to D&G, you might be thinking, oh, they have some pretty good answers, like answering Lacan. So definitely a lot of different things going on. Abby, I hope that made sense. I know you haven't been saying much, but I just hope that made sense.
Yeah, it did. I think you did a really good job at explaining it. You have a good grasp on everything.
Do you have any questions about like D&G or in general?
I think I'm good.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy that you ended up coming to this, and I hope that you learned a little bit of something. That's like my main goal. It's like, you know, having accessibility to psychoanalysis, critical theory, it's something that people always think of as just like this kind of elite academia, right? That like you have to be like this, you know, armchair philosopher type of person. But in general, this stuff is just fairly simple, I think, to understand if you just sort of break it down and don't use as like much of big words as like these other people think and they say, you know. But that's the gist of what I have. Abby, do you have like, I mean, any like debate things? Or I guess I want to ask you, why do you think psych is really, really good in debate?
Okay, so my phrasing of that was poor. I think that specifically against K affirmatives that have an in-round debate impact, I think it's a really good thing to read on the negative. And I think it's like one of the most strategic arguments. But against most other affirmatives, it's like mediocre. I don't think it's great. I think if you read Cap and Psycho, it's really good.
Yeah, right. Honestly, you do make a really good point, because those KFs that get up and they say, hey, we're going to change this space. I mean, Lacan is just sort of saying you're only doing that as a response, right, to the sort of drive that we had trying to create meaning. Like, I think with critical affirmative, psych makes a lot more sense, because when you think about it in the context of like a policy AF, I feel like you have to really do a huge framework push, right, about why desire is particularly important, especially because, you know, what is the alternative, right? What is our alternative as people to not want to continue fulfilling that lack?
Yeah. Well, I think like the like quote unquote alternative to psychoanalysis, like there isn't really an alternative. The way that I understand it is that like we tell them, or like we critique their approach to like their desires within the round, but we can't tell them how to debate, because it means we assert our ideas on them, which means that there's like no disadvantage to voting negative, but there is a disadvantage to voting affirmative because of their desires within the round.
Okay, I dig that. What do you think about critical psychoanalysis affirmatives?
I don't like them.
I don't like them either, because
like pretty blatantly, I don't like them.
And it's also just like, I just think in general, there's always some external object that you're trying to project, even if it's not the ballot. You know what I mean? Which is why I don't think that it makes a lot of sense on the app. But I do agree with you. I think on the neg against chaos especially, it's really good. And of course, if you execute it well in all of these instances, it can be a good argument, you know?
Yeah. I think reading it on the affirmative, like the way that people read it is that they take it, like they take the negative argument and then just read it on the affirmative. But there's a lot of problem with like a lot of problems with reading it on the affirmative because of the desires like for the ballot and for like the norms of debate.
Right.
And like reading it on the affirmative, I just don't think it makes sense. But against like KF specifically with in-round impacts, I love it.
Yeah, it's smart. It's a smart strategy for sure. Well, awesome. Well, again, thank you both for being here, and of course, thanks to Ethan. I know he had to leave early. But yeah, I mean, Abby, I do appreciate, especially what you added. I mean, you added some great stuff, and I know you knew a lot of this already, so I hope you took something from it. And even if you didn't, these discussions are always like really important to have, you know. Yeah. Thank you.
Text me if you ever want to have a discussion on any K-Lit or anything.
Yeah, exactly. And these things that I'm recording too, if you want to find a particular theory that you want to like spend a lot of time talking about, I mean, I'm really down to just like upload them to YouTube and just like make these conversations just kind of just so if someone wants to hear and listen and just get a basic grasp of some theory. I mean, I've already reached out to some people. I definitely, we could talk about whatever you want. So just let me know what theory you'd want to talk about and we can go into it. We can dive into it.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you, Abby, and thank you, Mikey. Appreciate it. I'm probably going to head out, though.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Bye. Thank you for a great lecture.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Abby. See you, Mikey.
Yeah. Thank you. No.
Bye.